I drove over to the rental house late in the afternoon, just planning to stop by and check the plumbing after my tenants had texted me about it. It was the kind of ordinary errand that had been on my shoulders for years, ever since I'd scraped together enough to buy my first property and then taught myself how to keep everything running smoothly. But the second I stepped out of the car, I froze. Violet Reed and Ryan Wright were standing at the front steps with two large suitcases planted beside their feet. Not an overnight bag, not the kind of drop-in visit where people chat for a while and then go home. The suitcases were upright and neatly lined up by the door, like they'd already moved past any hesitation a long time ago and were just waiting for me to unlock the house so they could walk in. I stared at them for a few seconds, my mind so blank I couldn't even manage a greeting. My mother adjusted the strap on her shoulder and looked around the front yard like she was assessing a place that was about to become hers. My father stood still, his face set in that rigid way it always got when he'd already made up his mind about something and had no interest in hearing objections. I spoke first, my voice dry. "What are you doing here?" Violet looked at me as if my question were the only unreasonable thing happening. "We're moving in, obviously. When the family is struggling, the family takes care of each other. This house belongs to you, which means it belongs to the family too." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. I turned and looked at the front door, the planter on the porch, the curtain behind the glass, everything familiar and brutally clear. Legal tenants were living inside, a young couple who had paid on time every month for the past 11 months. They were not shadows I could just push out of my life, because my parents had suddenly shown up with luggage. I took a slow breath. This house is rented. I can't throw them out so you can move in. Ryan Wright frowned, irritation flashing across his face almost immediately. "That's a cold way to talk, Ella. Your parents need a place to stay. You have rental property, you have assets. That's exactly why you should know how to share. Don't treat your own family like a ledger." I looked at him, that old familiar pressure settling on my chest again, the kind wrapped in duty and guilt, and the word family. Then my mother cut in, her voice softer than his but somehow sharper. "Our family is going through a special situation right now. Benjamin Robinson needs stability for a while. We've had to rearrange everything because of that. You're the strongest one in this family. You've always been able to take care of yourself. Is it really so terrible for you to make one sacrifice?" The second Benjamin's name came up, I knew this wasn't some impulsive decision they'd made that morning. This was the outcome of a whole chain of things that had happened behind my back. I looked straight at my mother. "Then say it clearly. You sold the old house, didn't you? Where did the money go?" Neither of them answered right away. That silence alone made my heart drop. I asked again, slower this time, each word dragged out of my mouth like a dull blade. "The $650,000 from selling the house, you gave it to Benjamin Robinson, didn't you?" Violet didn't deny it. She just pressed her lips together and answered me in the same tone I'd heard my whole life. "Your brother is weaker than you. He needs more help. You've always been capable. You've always been able to stand on your own 2 feet. We thought you'd be mature enough to understand." I laughed, one short hollow sound. That had always been how every injustice in my family got packaged and handed to me. Benjamin was allowed to fail because he was fragile. Benjamin got rescued because he was struggling. And I was expected to carry everything because I was strong enough to survive it. I started working young. I rented my own place. I paid my own debts. I saved and saved until I could buy this property. Every step I took was built with my money, my labor, my sleepless nights. Benjamin always had a hand reaching out before he ever had to hit the ground. I kept my voice low, because I knew if it rose even a little, I wasn't going to be able to stop. This is not just about feelings. I have a lease agreement. I have legal responsibilities. I have a mortgage to pay. I have my reputation. I cannot tell decent people to leave just because you want to live here for free. Ryan took a step forward, his eyes turning cold. "You're talking like we're strangers. We need you to help this family get through a difficult time." "I am helping by stating what's legal and what's right," I shot back, and it was the first time my own voice had sounded that hard to me. "You cannot show up at my property with suitcases and just assume I'm going to break a lease to accommodate a decision you already made without me." My mother crossed her arms, all softness gone from her face now. "Everything has already been arranged. We already told other people we'd be moving in this week." I felt the blood in my body turn cold. Not because they needed a place to stay, but because they had gone so far as to make promises to other people about my property, as if my right to decide had quietly transferred from me to them somewhere along the way. I looked at the 2 suitcases, then at the faces of the 2 people who had raised me, and for the first time, I realized that in their minds, I had never really had ownership over my own life. Before I could even ask who those other people were, Violet looked me straight in the eye and said something that sent a chill down my spine. "Everything is already settled, Ella. You just need to stop making things difficult for the family." I set my phone down on the car hood, looked straight at my parents, and asked the question I should have asked years ago. I want the truth, not more evasive answers. The old house sold for $650,000. Why did every cent of that go to Benjamin Robinson, and now the 2 of you show up at my property with suitcases like I'm automatically supposed to rearrange my entire life? My father frowned slightly, that familiar expression he used whenever he wanted to turn a straightforward question into an act of disrespect. He put his hands on his hips, his voice dropping. "Ella Parker, you're talking like a stranger. That money was your parents' asset. We have the right to give it to whoever we want." "Of course," I shot back. "You absolutely have the right to give it to whoever you want, but if you gave all of it to Benjamin Robinson, then the responsibility should go with that decision, and too. You can't pile all the good parts onto one person, then dump the trouble, the expense, the housing, the legal risk, all of it, onto me." My mother let out a dry little laugh, the kind that chilled me more than when she raised her voice. "You've always been strong. You can take care of yourself. That's why we never worried about you. Benjamin is different. He needed a push to settle his future." I looked at her and heard not a trace of gratitude for all the years I had fought my way through life on my own. There was only one thing in that sentence, an assumption. The assumption that because I could endure, I should endure. That's because I could handle it. I should handle it. That I was not allowed to call it unfair. So I asked slowly, "Settle his future how? Buy a house? Start a business? Pay off debt? Was there any actual plan?" My father avoided my eyes. "Benjamin said he was going to invest it, and later, once he was in a better position, he'd take care of us." "Invest in what?" "He's working it out." "Working out what?" My mother cut in, her tone already sharpening. "Why are you interrogating us like this? Your brother is not some parasite." I laughed, and this time I couldn't keep it in. "If he's not, then why aren't you living with Benjamin Robinson? $650,000 is enough to provide a decent home, or at the very least, a stable place to live. What exactly is wrong with me asking that?" The air on the porch turned heavy. My mother looked away first, as if refusing to look at me could somehow make my words lose their force. My father spoke more quietly, but every word landed like a stone. "Don't start keeping score with the people who gave you life." That hit the deepest bruise. I nodded and kept my voice so calm that even I was surprised by it. "I'm not keeping score with my parents. I'm refusing to be turned into the backup plan after everything was poured into Benjamin Robinson. If you trusted him enough to hand over the entire asset, then you also have to accept the consequences of that trust." My mother stared at me, looking both furious and disappointed. "You sound so cold. This is just a family housing issue, and you're talking like we're in court." "Because this actually could end up in court," I said flatly. "Tenants are living in that house. They have a legal lease. I cannot throw them out just because my parents want to move in, and I will not do that." They both froze for a few seconds, as if it had only just occurred to them that this house was not some empty spare room in their imagination, but a real property with laws attached to it. My mother pressed her lips together and yanked hard on her bag strap. My father said, "You're making this into a bigger issue than it is." "No," I said. "Everyone else has been minimizing it for far too long." My parents left after that, not because I had convinced them, but because they could no longer argue the way they usually did. Before she got into the car, my mother turned back and threw one last sentence at me. "You'll understand one day. When you really need family, money won't solve anything." I stood there, watching the car disappear at the end of the street. The anger wasn't burning hot anymore. What was left was something colder, clearer, and more painful. I picked up my phone and called Addison Bennett. She answered almost immediately. I gave her the short version, from the suitcases at my door to the $650,000, to my parents wanting me to force the tenants out. Addison was quiet for a few seconds, then asked just one question. Do you have any texts or emails from them? Not yet. Most of it was said in person. Then from now on, text only. No more emotional verbal agreements. You need clear evidence. Your tenants have a lease, and their rights are protected. Even if these are your parents, they do not have the right to interfere, and they definitely cannot make promises on your behalf. I leaned back against the car and closed my eyes. I think something is off, Addison. The way they talk about Benjamin Robinson is so vague. No plan, no numbers, just vague promises that he'll stabilize, he'll take care of them later, he's figuring things out. Addison lowered her voice. Then maybe the money isn't there the way they think it is. That made my eyes snap open. The scattered pieces started clicking together on their own. Benjamin Robinson's flashy trips lately. The expensive things he'd been showing off online. The way my parents dodged every question I asked about their future. Maybe that money had never gone into building anything stable. Maybe it had flowed into something more reckless, more superficial. And if it had all fallen apart, then I was the cushion they had lined up in advance for the whole family to land on. I didn't even get a chance to say another word before my phone buzzed. A message from my tenant lit up the screen. Ella, a man just came by and said he's related to the new owner. He told my family we should start preparing to move out soon. What is going on? By the time I finished reading it, a chill had gone straight down my spine. This was no longer just a family argument. Someone had started interfering with my property and my tenants. I left my parents right after my father's last sentence, but the tightness in my chest still wouldn't ease. I went straight across the yard, calling my tenants to tell them I was coming over immediately. During that short walk from the gate to the back porch, my head was spinning with anger and shame. Anger that my parents had pushed things this far on their own, and shame that people who had absolutely nothing to do with this were being dragged into my family's ugly power struggle. I knocked, and when Carter Mitchell opened the door, I saw the tension on his face right away. I didn't need to ask many questions to know exactly how badly the atmosphere in that house had been shaken. I apologized first. Then I said, clearly, slowly, and firmly, that the lease was still valid, every term remained in effect, and no one, including my parents, had any right to ask them to leave. I repeated that legally, the house belonged to me, and any communication related to their housing had to go through me, not anyone else. Carter leaned against the doorframe, while Theodore Marshall stood behind him with his arms folded tightly, his eyes still guarded. I understood that reaction. If two older people showed up at your home with suitcases, speaking with absolute certainty, as if they had the power to decide your fate as tenants, who wouldn't be rattled? I told them I would handle it, but the moment the words left my mouth, they tasted bitter. Since when had I become someone who had to reassure other people that my own parents would not trespass on my property? Carter invited me in to sit for a few minutes and told me everything. The more I listened, the colder I felt. He said my mother had spoken first, her tone soft but her meaning unyielding. She told them that this house was meant to serve the family, and that the people living there should know what's appropriate if the owner needed to use it. My father had gone even further. He stood in the living room, looking around as if he were reassessing something that already belonged to him, then said a line Carter remembered word for word. Sooner or later, everything will have to be put back in its proper place. Carter said that at that point, he had asked them directly whether they were the landlords, and my father had not answered plainly. He only said, in that evasive way of his, that this is a private family matter, and outsiders don't need to interfere. That was the truly frightening part, because it was meant to blur the boundaries on purpose, meant to create the impression that they had more authority than they actually did. I asked Carter what worried him most. He was quiet for a moment before saying, I'm not just worried about being thrown out. I'm worried they'll come back when you're not here. Today, they talked like people who already had a key. That made my spine go rigid. I looked over at Theodore, and he nodded, adding that my father had walked around the side of the house and inspected the back door and side entrance very closely. This was no longer a momentary outburst from two people backed into a corner. This was deliberate, planned, calculated. It carried the confidence of people who believed that in the end, I would give in for the sake of family. I hadn't even had time to steady myself before my phone vibrated. Benjamin Robinson was calling. I stepped out onto the porch to answer, and the second I heard him breathing on the other end, I knew he wasn't calling to apologize. Benjamin started in with that performative, weary voice, saying our parents had sacrificed their whole lives, that they were getting old, that surely I could stop being so rigid just this once. He never mentioned the $650,000. He never mentioned the fact that he had taken all of it and disappeared the moment responsibility showed up. I let him finish, then said flatly, "Sacrifice is not a license to erase a lease. It's not a license to take someone else's property and dump the consequences on me for you." Benjamin paused for a beat, then changed his tone, lower and colder. He said I was blowing this out of proportion, that if I really cared about our parents, I would have let them move in from the beginning. I gave a dry laugh, the kind that exhausted even me. If you really cared about our parents, you wouldn't have taken all the money from the house sale and left them dragging suitcases to my property. I hung up before he could twist the story again. That call did only one thing. It confirmed that Benjamin was still hiding behind the same old moral rhetoric, letting our parents stand on the front line and apply pressure while he kept his hands clean on paper. Before I left, I went to check the entire house. I tested the front door, the side door, and then moved to the back. There was a fresh scratch on the lock there, tiny but unmistakable, enough for me to know someone had recently tried a key in it. My heart started pounding so hard my ears rang. I stood frozen for a few seconds, then opened the small utility cabinet on the porch, where, years ago, I had once kept a spare key, back before the title had been fully transferred, and I had changed everything. That key set was no longer where it used to be. I stood there for a long time in front of the lock, my heart sinking as I realized that the first people who had ever forced me to think about changing my locks were my own parents. But what truly made me go cold was not that they still had an old key. What truly made me go cold was that when I bent down and looked at the gap under the door, I saw a folded piece of paper that had been pushed through at some point. On the outside was just one line, written in my mother's handwriting: "If you keep being this stubborn, your father and I will let ourselves in and take back what belongs to this family." That evening, I was the one who called for the conversation. I didn't want my parents lingering outside my rental house any longer, and I didn't want this to turn into one of those situations where whoever shouted the loudest got to win. I asked Violet Reed, Ryan Wright, and Benjamin Robinson to come to my apartment, a place neutral enough that no one could use stepping into an occupied property as an excuse to act as if they owned it. The moment all three of them sat down, I knew this wasn't going to be a conversation meant to heal anything. The air felt thick, as if each of us had arrived carrying a different version of the truth. I spoke first, calmer than I expected to be. I said the rental house was legally occupied. I had a lease, financial obligations, and legal responsibilities, and I was not going to throw Carter Mitchell and Anna Adams out of their home just to patch over the consequences of a decision I had no part in making. I made it very clear that this time, no one was going to force me to choose between morality and family, because putting innocent people out on the street had never been moral in the first place. I thought that level of honesty would at least drag us back to the actual issue. But the second I finished, my mother leaned back and looked at me like I was someone she barely recognized. She said I was cold. She said that ever since I was young, I had been too rational, always measuring everything by right and wrong as if I were dealing with strangers. My father picked up where she left off, saying that when parents were in trouble, hearing their own daughter put rules and laws in front of them hurt more than any refusal could. I sat there in silence for a few seconds, listening to each word land, like familiar stones, that old feeling of being turned into the guilty one, simply because I dared to have boundaries. Benjamin was different. He had been quiet from the start, fingers laced together, wearing a carefully arranged look of exhaustion that made him seem harmless. Only when the room had grown heavy enough did he finally speak, gently, as though he were there to mediate. Benjamin said everyone in this family had helped each other before, that a family couldn't function on paperwork and terms. He looked at me and, in that even, measured voice, asked why, when our parents needed help most, I was putting so much weight on the law and so little on love. The second he said it, something inside me snapped. I cut him off immediately. I wasn't going to let him steer the conversation 1 inch further. I said helping each other did not mean trampling on someone else's right to a home. It also did not mean that for years, one person got to receive all the favors, while another was simply expected to absorb all the damage. I looked straight at Benjamin and asked the question everyone had been avoiding from the very beginning. Where is the $650,000? The whole table went silent. I didn't turn to my parents. I kept my eyes on him. I asked what he had done with the money, what his plan was to pay our parents back, and if everything was really as fine as everyone had claimed, then why were they now showing up at my property with a suitcase? At first, Benjamin tried to keep his voice steady. He said business had ups and downs, that the money wasn't gone, it was just tied up. I asked where. He answered vaguely. I kept asking. That was when the calm surface finally cracked. Benjamin snapped and said I didn't understand the pressure of maintaining status, of preserving an image, of staying committed to investments once you were already too deep to pull out halfway. That was enough. I understood then that most of the money was nearly gone. Some of it had been thrown into bad investments. Some of it had been burned to keep alive the image of success my parents had believed in for years. The truth was sitting there in front of me, more naked and pathetic than I had imagined. My parents weren't just looking for a temporary place to stay. They had almost nowhere else to go, because they had staked their entire old age on Benjamin, and Benjamin had kept pretending everything was under control until there was nothing left to control. When I spoke, my own voice sounded rough and scraped raw. What hurts me most isn't that Benjamin failed. Anyone can fail. What hurts me is that this family treats it like the most natural thing in the world, that I'll be the last wall standing, the one everyone gets to crash into. Ryan Wright stared down at the table longer than usual. For the first time since the conversation began, I saw him waver. But Violet Reed didn't. She kept clinging to Benjamin the way people cling to a dream they refuse to let die. She said he had just been unlucky, that if I would compromise one more time, Benjamin would have time to get back on his feet, and then everything could be fixed. I laughed, a short, cold sound that felt unfamiliar even to me. I asked her how exactly she planned to fix it, using my money, my property, or by throwing my tenants out onto the street. No one answered right away. Then, in a burst of desperation, as if she wanted to end the argument by declaring one final truth, my mother blurted out something that froze the entire room. She said that, honestly, all along, she and my father had always believed that the rental house should have belonged to Benjamin. For a few seconds after that, I couldn't hear anything else. Every sound seemed to fall away. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and his silence hurt even more than what she had just said. That was when I finally understood this had never been only about letting them stay temporarily. I wasn't just being used now that everything had fallen apart. I had been pushed out of my own rights a long time ago. This was just the first day they had accidentally said it out loud. After that disastrous conversation, I didn't want to keep letting my sense of betrayal guide me. Emotion could make the pain feel sharp, but it wasn't enough to help me understand everything that had actually happened. I needed something more solid than arguments thrown back and forth, more solid than my mother's tears or my father's irritated tone, more solid than the slick promises Benjamin had been making for years. Close to midnight, I sat down alone, opened my laptop, and pulled up old emails, old text messages, photos of documents, transfer histories, things I had never imagined I would one day use to cross-check against my own family. The next morning, I called Theodore Marshall. Theodore wasn't close to my parents, and he wasn't caught in the same orbit of defending Benjamin that so many other people in the family seemed trapped in. He was an accountant, practical, and especially intolerant of vague storytelling. I said only one thing. Can you help me look at this through data? I'm afraid I'm too angry right now. Theodore was quiet for a few seconds, then told me to send him everything I had. By that afternoon, he was sitting across from me at my dining table, breaking everything into milestones. The date the house was sold, the date the money hit the account, the day Benjamin texted my father, the day my mother called me. Even the times my parents had suddenly asked about the status of my rental house, questions I had naively thought were just casual concern at the time. Once the pieces were laid side by side, one thing emerged with chilling clarity. Every person in my family had been given a different version of the truth. To me, My parents had said they sold the house because they were getting older, wanted to simplify their lives, and wanted less maintenance to worry about. To their old neighbors, my mother said they were about to move somewhere better, closer to medical services. But in an email my mother had accidentally forwarded to me months earlier, Benjamin had written something else entirely. This was only temporary, the money just needed to be rotated through a short-term deal, and afterward, he would pay back every cent. He would even buy my parents a decent condo, better than their old house. I read that email over and over until my throat felt tight. So my parents hadn't thought they were throwing their only home into a pit. They believed Benjamin. They believed him enough to sign the paperwork to sell the house, while expecting some late-life turnaround waiting on the other side. That truth didn't lessen their fault, because they had still favored him, still been willing to sacrifice stability to save the child they had always treated as more special than me. But it made the picture far more twisted. They weren't just the people pressuring me. They were also people being led by the blind faith they had spent years nurturing with their own hands. Theodore kept following financial traces I never would have thought to examine. Some of the large transactions Benjamin had explained to my parents as advances for business partners had actually appeared months before the house was ever sold. A credit card debt had already gone delinquent before that. A demand for payment email from a law office had been sent to my parents' old address, then forwarded to Benjamin. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. His collapse wasn't some sudden new disaster. It was a hole that had been dug long ago, covered over with confident talk, neat clothes, and a constant effort to keep my parents believing that if they could just hold on a little longer, everything would slide back into place. I started to understand why, every time he was cornered, Benjamin would turn and start talking about family responsibility, about how I had a house while our parents didn't. He was never looking for a solution. He was buying time. Every week that passed was another week he managed to push the truth farther away, and during that time, my property had already been placed in people's minds as the obvious rescue plan. The thought made me shiver. The worst part came when Theodore found an old text thread in a backup I had downloaded before but never really examined. In one part of it, Benjamin was texting my mother, asking very specifically whose name was on the paperwork for my rental house, whether the property still had any loan attached to it, and whether, if it was just internal family support, arrangements could be made for my parents to start receiving mail there first. My mother's reply was vague, but Benjamin's final line left me numb. If Ella agrees to let Mom and Dad move in first, everything will be easier to handle later. Easier to handle later. Those words kept slamming into my head like something dry and cold. Benjamin had never been thinking only about finding my parents a temporary place to stay. He had already been considering how to edge his way into my property, step by step through guilt, through the language of family, through a fait accompli that, if I gave in even once, could cost me control over everything. I sat there for a long time, staring at the harsh glow of the screen in front of me, and for the first time, I fully understood that this fight had never been only about favoritism. It was a backup plan that had been aimed at my house for a very long time. I thought that once I traced the murky money trail and found out Benjamin had swallowed almost all of the house sale money with his terrible decisions, the path forward would finally be clear. But the truth was, the moment one corner of the curtain was pulled back, pressure came crashing in from every side like a flood current. Carter Mitchell called me first, his voice tight. He said strangers had been standing outside the house asking how much longer the lease had left, hinting that the landlord was about to take the house back for family. Anna Adams sent me a long message, polite but full of worry, asking if something serious was happening and whether they needed to prepare to find somewhere else to live. At the same time, my phone kept lighting up with messages from relatives. Some called me selfish. Some said my parents were old, and I was still counting pennies with them. Benjamin clearly wasn't sitting still. He was telling the version of the story that made him look best. That he only received the money because our parents gave it willingly, that I had a house and property yet was still letting the people who raised me wander without shelter, that I was turning a family matter into a legal one just because of money. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone screen like it was a warped mirror. For years, I had lived by swallowing one sentence to keep the peace, stepping back once to end the fight, telling myself that if I was doing better, carrying a little more was no big deal. But this time, If I stayed quiet just to preserve the image of the good, reasonable daughter, I would lose more than an argument. I would lose the house I had worked for. I would lose the trust of the tenants who were relying on my decency. And worst of all, I would once again let other people define me as the one who was always supposed to sacrifice and never allowed to push back. I took the initiative and called everyone to the law office Theodore Marshall had recommended. I didn't want another argument in a living room, where emotion could be used to crush the truth. When Violet Reed, Ryan Wright, and Benjamin walked in, I saw the irritation on Benjamin's face immediately. He wasn't used to sitting in a place where words came with consequences. I let them sit down, then opened the folder in front of me. My hands were cold, but my voice was steadier than it had ever been. I said, "Today I'm going to say everything, once and for all. That house is my property, and it is legally rented to tenants. No one in this family has the right to force me to evict them. No one has the right to stand outside that house, pressuring them or spreading rumors to scare them." Benjamin gave a sharp little laugh, trying to cut in, but I didn't stop. Ever since we were kids, because I could take care of myself, everyone just assumed I could take a little more. Benjamin needs help, so I give way. Benjamin gets in trouble, so I'm supposed to be understanding. Benjamin does something wrong, and the whole family calls it a mistake. But when I set a boundary, I become the ungrateful child. Do any of you know what that sounds like? It sounds like my hard work doesn't deserve respect just because I'm not as good at falling apart and demanding attention as he is. The whole room went quiet. Ryan Wright looked down at the table, his shoulders locking up. Violet Reed opened her mouth several times, then stopped herself. Only Benjamin still tried to hold on to that defiant expression. He said, "You're blowing this way out of proportion. It's just a temporary place to stay, and you're turning it into a war." I looked him straight in the eye. "Temporary how, Benjamin? By taking over my house, throwing 2 innocent people out on the street, and then leaving me to carry the legal fallout for whatever you've done?" Theodore slid a printed document toward Ryan Wright. It showed that Benjamin hadn't just spent all the money. He was being chased over multiple personal loans, including one that had been overdue long enough for the lender to prepare a lawsuit. The air in the room changed in seconds. Ryan jerked his head up, his face draining of color. Violet turned to Benjamin, and for the first time, there was real alarm in her eyes instead of automatic defense. Benjamin lashed out and said it was private, but his panic gave everything away. He wasn't clinging to my house because he needed a temporary place to stay. He needed a stable address, a place to hide while he bought time, something that looked secure enough to keep juggling the debt that was closing in behind him. I took a new set of keys out of my bag and placed them on the table. "I've changed the locks. From today on, any communication about that house will be in writing. If anyone harasses my tenants again or claims any right to use that property, I will handle it through the law. I am not going to save this family by taking my work and other innocent people's safety and throwing them into the hole Benjamin dug." This time, no one shouted at me, maybe because they had finally realized I was no longer the easy option, the one they could still bend. I had barely stepped out of the office, my breathing not even steady yet, when my phone rang. It was Theodore. His voice was lower than usual. "Ella, don't go home alone just yet. I just received another file. Benjamin doesn't just owe money. There's paperwork connected to the rental property's address, and I think your brother used it for something much more serious." I never expected the person who would blow everything wide open to be Benjamin. After I sent the formal notice to my lawyer, to the building manager, and to both Carter Mitchell and Anna Adams, confirming that their tenant rights were still fully protected, Benjamin came to find me on his own. He no longer had that half-baked confidence he'd worn the last few times, but his eyes still carried that familiar stubbornness of someone who was used to letting other people clean up his messes. I stood on the front steps and didn't invite him in. Violet Reed and Ryan Wright stood behind him, looking like they had aged years in a matter of days, as if all at once they had lost their house, lost their dignity, and were now on the verge of losing the one child who was still willing to stand there and hear them out. Benjamin looked at me, his voice rough. "Fine. If you want the truth, I'll tell you all of it." I didn't answer. I just folded my arms and let him step into the silence he had created for himself. He admitted that the $650,000 had never been sitting safely in an account, the way my parents believed. Part of it had gone to pay off debts that had already been piling up, and the rest had been thrown into deals he called once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. He borrowed more money to cover the losses, used one amount to patch over another, and built a fake picture that everything was still under control. The messages about profits, the expansion plans, the promises that he would soon buy our parents an even better house, none of it had been real. It had all been a way to buy more time. "I thought I only needed a few more months," Benjamin said, his eyes reddening. "I thought I could win it back." I laughed, but the sound was so cold that even I barely recognized it. "You didn't think anything. You gambled with our parents' money, and when you lost, you pushed them onto my doorstep." No one could argue with that. Violet looked stunned, almost lifeless. She turned to stare at Benjamin, her lips trembling too hard to form words. Ryan Wright took a full step back, his hand clenching into a fist before slowly falling open again. In their eyes, I could see a kind of pain that was completely real now, not the anger of people being challenged, but the shock of finally understanding that they had placed all their trust in the wrong person. They had sold their home, emptied the safety net of their old age, and then turned around and tried to force me to surrender my own property, as if that were the most natural obligation in the world. The person who hurt me most was my mother. Violet looked at me, and for the first time since this whole thing began, she wasn't using that voice that always decided things for me. She broke down crying right there at the door, crying so hard she had to brace herself against the wall just to stay upright. "I just thought you'd handle it," she said in broken gasps. "All your life, you were always the one who stepped in. I thought this time you'd find a way too." That hurt more than all the blame and accusations that had come before it. What they called trust was never really trust at all. It was dependence, stretched far past the point of decency. They believed that no matter how much they favored Benjamin, no matter how lightly they treated my rights, in the end, I would still come back and carry whatever was left. That belief was exactly what made them keep the old key, call themselves the ones with the authority to decide, and even tell people from the church that they would soon be moving into my house, as if it were already settled. I looked at each of them in turn, my voice slow but firm. "I am not the net that catches every fall in this family. Carter and Anna are real people. They have real leases and real lives. So do I. Tears today do not erase the fact that all of you were ready to take away my right to decide." Ryan lowered his head. A long time passed before he managed to say a single sentence, awkward and painfully sincere. "I'm sorry." I had waited so long to hear those words that when they finally came, they didn't bring the relief I had imagined. They only made me feel tired. Benjamin turned his face away. Violet was still crying, but I didn't step toward her. I couldn't. At that exact moment, my phone started vibrating over and over in my hand. A message from Carter flashed across the screen, so short and urgent it made my heart drop. "Ella, someone just called my workplace and said I should get ready to move out if I don't want bigger trouble. I don't think this is over." I tightened my grip on the phone, looked up at the three of them in front of me, and understood with perfect clarity that the first apology may have finally arrived, but if I wanted to save what was left, I still had to put justice ahead of family. The next morning, the first thing I did was not call my parents, and it wasn't text Benjamin either. I called Carter Mitchell and Anna Adams. I asked to meet both of them at the rental property itself, and I brought copies of the lease, confirmation from my lawyer, and a formal notice that their tenancy remained fully intact. I apologized for letting my family's mess spill into their lives, and forced them to live with a sense of threat over something that should never have involved them in the first place. Carter looked at me for a long moment before letting out a heavy breath. He said he had barely slept the past few days because someone had been standing outside, looking in as if they were sizing up the house. Anna asked me directly whether anyone was still going to come by and pressure them. I answered clearly, slowly, that they would not be forced out because of my family's needs, and that if anyone came back to harass them, I would handle it legally. I would not leave them carrying this alone again. Saying those words, I felt something inside me lighten. At least in the one place that mattered most, I had not betrayed my own line. I also took the initiative to reduce part of their rent for the following month, as a way of taking responsibility. Anna was surprised, and Carter refused at first, but I told them this was not a payoff and it wasn't for show. It was how I intended to repair some of the harm my family had done to their sense of safety. When I left the house, I paused at the gate for a few seconds. For the first time in weeks, I did not see it as a battlefield. It had returned to what it was supposed to be. A property I had built, and the lawful home of two people who had trusted my word. It wasn't until that afternoon that I met my parents at a small restaurant near my lawyer's office. I did not hand over any keys. I did not invite them to the rental house, and I did not let the conversation drift back into the same old pattern of blame. I placed a folder in front of them. Inside was a list of temporary housing options for seniors, information on short-term apartment rentals, and an offer to help cover rent for the first 3 months under clear conditions. I would pay for the new place directly. I would not hand over cash. I would not co-sign anything, and I would not let anyone use pity to bend my boundaries again. My mother looked down at the papers, her eyes reddening. She asked me if I really had to be this cold. My voice was so calm it surprised even me when I answered, "I'm not being cold. I'm helping in a way that doesn't destroy someone else's life, and doesn't destroy mine too." My father sat in silence for a long while before he finally spoke. He asked whether, if they agreed to move into temporary housing, I would still consider them my parents. That question hurt more than all the accusations before it, because it laid bare the exact pattern that had weighed on me for years. That family love was only acknowledged when I was willing to sacrifice myself. I looked him straight in the eye. "I am still your daughter, but I am no longer the person who patches every consequence with silence." This time, no one raised their voice. Maybe because everything had gone too far to be salvaged by a few emotional lines. My mother broke down crying, but I did not rush to comfort her the way I would have before. I let her cry. Then I slid a glass of water toward her and said that if they wanted, I would go with them tomorrow to look at places. If they didn't, my decision about the house would still not change. Benjamin called me that evening. His voice was quieter than it had ever been before. He said our parents were blaming him, relatives were turning their backs on him, a few debts were starting to close in, and he asked whether I could say a word for him. I leaned back in my chair and listened, but my chest no longer burned the way it had before. What remained was a kind of clarity that was almost cold. I told Benjamin he would have to deal with the life he had made for himself. I was not going to smear him, but I was not going to save him either. Justice is not revenge. Justice is consequences returning to where they were created. After that call, I sat alone for a long time. I thought about the old house that had been sold, about the $650,000 that had flowed into the hands of the one person who had always been favored, about all the years I had been pushed into the role of the one who carried everything, and was still called selfish the moment I refused one more time. I thought I would feel more bitterness than this, but what remained most clearly was peace. Not the sweet kind of peace, but the stillness of someone who had finally taken her rightful place. It will take time for my parents to understand, maybe a very long time. Benjamin will also have to walk the road he has spent his whole life avoiding. My family cannot be called healed yet. Some fractures do not close overnight. But for the first time in my life, I helped without erasing myself in the process. I kept the door to the rental house closed, kept my promise to the tenants, and kept the self-respect I had spent so long believing I had to trade away in order to be called a good daughter. I did not give them the house, I gave them another path. And this time, I kept my life too.